Hi, well, we're continuing on with understanding pieces of the liturgy in a little more detail to help us enter more deeply into the prayers on Sunday. We are now looking at the portion that is called the Great Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving, the word Eucharist, has its roots in the Greek word for thanksgiving. So it is us approaching God with gratitude. That's a biblical response to God's goodness. There's someone named Philo of Alexandria. He was a Jewish philosopher he was born in 25 BC, died in 50 AD. This is what he said: "We affirm that the activity most characteristic of God is to give his blessings, but that most fitting to creation is to give thanks, because that is the best it can offer him in return. For when creation tries to make any other return to God, it finds that its gift already belongs to the creator of the universe, not to the creature offering it. Since we now realize that to give due worship to God only, one duty is incumbent upon us, that of giving thanks. We must carry it out in all times and in all places." So again, that's Philo of Alexandria. So this idea that the proper place of a creature in response to the goodness of God is to give thanks. And giving thanks in Greek is Eucharist. It comes by a few different names. We sometimes call it the Lord's Supper, we call it the Mass, we call it Holy Eucharist, we call it the agape meal sometimes, we call it communion. There's a number of ways that we refer to this meal that we're doing with the bread and the wine. What is happening in this Eucharistic prayer is that we are entering into the Lord's Supper. So before Jesus died, he gathered with his disciples, and they had what many believe to be a Passover meal. And Jesus uses a lot of that symbolism in that meal in reference to the Paschal lamb that was offered. We see Jesus referring to himself in kind of sacrificial language. Right? So the Paschal lamb is in memory of the Exodus. So in Exodus, the blood of the lamb was put on the doorway to protect the people from death that would pass through Egypt. And Jesus uses this kind of language as well. But maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. He uses this fourfold language. So we are trying to draw the memory of the Lord's Supper into the present. A Jewish way of doing memorial isn't just remembering something that had happened. It's almost to enter into that moment again. And so what we are doing as we reenact this Lord's Supper, and we know that the disciples did this. We read about that in Acts 2. We read it in 1 Corinthians 11. So we know that this is something that the disciples were doing regularly. They were gathering and receiving bread and wine, remembering the Last Supper, remembering what Jesus said. And so when Jesus invited them into the supper, he had a fourfold action. He took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them. So 1, took bread, 2, given thanks, 3, broke it, and 4, gave it to them. So this fourfold action we read about within the Gospels. We make sure that we are enacting this again. We are inviting Jesus to be present again through these actions. Jesus spoke in a sacrificial manner about the bread and the wine. He talked about it as being his body and his blood. His body is given up, his blood is poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And these words work themselves into the various prayers at the Eucharist. And there's a number of different ways in which this is made known to us, this kind of sacrificial language. Sometimes they talk about it reflecting the language of Isaiah 53, talking about Jesus taking on, by his stripes we are healed. There's this vicarious exchange that Jesus takes on something that was ours. Also, there's this reflection of the sacrificial system in ancient Israel that we find in how we understand the Lord's Supper. We also understand this as almost like an exodus as well, that Jesus provides something that gives us an escape from sin and death. So there's a number of ways to think about this. The churches often understand this as a very powerful thing. That when the place of the altar in the church, if your church is based on the symbolism of the temple in Jerusalem, the table is the Holy of Holies. It's where the Ark of the Covenant would have been in the temple. And the curtain has been torn apart so that we have free access to the space. It no longer needs to be restricted from us. The curtain has been torn by God, by what Jesus did, and that allows free access to God. We believe that by approaching this Eucharist, this bread and wine, we are entering into the most holy moment that is available to us on earth. That Jesus himself is making himself available to us, to enter into us, into our own bodies. We sometimes call these the words of institution, this fourfold pattern, because these are words that Jesus instituted himself. We're trying to do what he did, and he has told us to do what he did, so that we would remember him, but also so that it would give us a way to speak to him, to commune with him in a unique and special way. I heard one person say that to receive communion, you can call up somebody on the telephone, you can access them by Zoom, but there's something different about being in person with them. And to receive communion is like being with Jesus in person as opposed to being on the phone with him or being over Zoom with him. That's one kind of analogy or metaphor, one way of thinking about this. We'll talk more about this, more about the pieces of the communion liturgy and more about this Holy Eucharist. But I just wanted to, I hope those pieces kind of start to paint a little bit of the picture of what's happening here. We are reenacting the Lord's Supper. We are remembering the sacrifice that Christ has made for us and that he has opened the way to God's grace in a unique and special way. That is what's happening as we start to enter into the Eucharistic prayer. We're recognizing what Jesus has done and what he has made available to us.